Hey plant lovers, welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be sharing my experience overall of the jade plant, and it's of this plant in particular because I've actually owned this plant now for probably about 3 to 4 years. So I thought it might be quite interesting for me to kind of just go into what that experience has been like, and it's always interesting to hear from someone who has an experience with a plant over a number of years. So as I say, I've had this plant for probably about 3 to 4 years. I'm kind of estimating because I've actually had this plant for quite some time. In fact, I had it way before I actually got into plants, if you know what I mean. So I had this one as a sort of a casual plant. I used to keep it on my windowsill. In fact, it still lives in the same place today as it did all those years ago. And I'd say when I got it, it was probably about this big. It was just a tiny little plant, and you know, you sometimes get succulents sold as novelty succulents and they come in those tiny little planters. This one came in a small planter, and I got this one from a supermarket. When I bought it, I had no idea how to care for it. In fact, previously I had unalived several succulents due to not knowing how to care for them, mostly from overwatering. But this plant marked a little bit of a change in me in that I decided to do a little bit of research. And this is around the time when I started looking on YouTube for videos on how to care for this plant. So I'd look up how you'd care for the jade plant. And in fact, I didn't even know it was called a jade plant. This is how into plants I was at this time. I eventually, of course, found out that it's a jade plant. And yeah, I looked up some care advice and I discovered what I should be doing. Luckily, in time, I discovered, so I didn't manage to lose this plant. And I pretty much found out that you should let this plant dry out and you shouldn't overwater it. And I remember when I first researched this and I heard that overwatering can mean the end of the plant. At first I took that a little bit too overboard, and I kind of starved the plant of water a little more than I should, maybe waited a little longer than I should. And as a result, I started to get some sort of misshapen leaves. There was almost a kind of a notch in the leaves rather than the oval shape. And so yeah, I think as a new plant parent back then, I kind of took that advice far too to heart, and I was terrified of watering this plant. So yeah, I did get some misshapen leaves for a while, and eventually I worked out again from looking on YouTube that I was possibly underwatering now. So it's become a little bit of a balancing act, I'd say, over the years to try and get it right. And I learned that this plant does like to be watered. It just likes to completely dry out in between, but that doesn't mean that I need to leave it for weeks on end until it's kind of past dry. So these days I do water this plant freely during spring, summer when it dries out. And then in winter, I'm a little bit more mean with the watering. I might leave it a little bit longer. And yeah, I've got the nice shapes of the leaves again. I haven't had any misshapen leaves since I've been following that water routine. I've also had this plant in different lighting situations over the years. And back in the start of having this plant, when I wasn't really a kind of a hardcore plant collector, and of course this was ages before my YouTube channel, because my YouTube channel is only about 6 months old, so we're talking years before that. And I had this plant in different lighting situations. I had it on the windowsill in my kitchen, which is where it lives now. I was kind of on the money there, but I didn't know. I then moved it into the living room for a little while, and eventually, luckily, I worked out that there was not enough light in the living room for this plant, and so I moved it back to the windowsill. And yeah, basically when I started just leaving the plant alone and letting it sit there, bathe in the sun, and yeah, just completely dry it between watering, that's when it got happy. And another thing I discovered is that if you snip the tops off the plant, it will then branch out. And I'll just find an example. Do I have an example? Of course I do. There, if you can see, you've got branches coming out. Well, to get this plant to branch out more, you can prune the tops off and then it will grow more branches and kind of turn into a bushier tree. And again, I discovered this on YouTube. I was really scared to prune this plant, to snip it, because I was terrified it wouldn't grow back. But eventually I got the courage up to do it, and I did chop it. And of course it was much smaller than this when I did that. And afterwards I was absolutely terrified. I would go back to the plant several times a day trying to check if anything was happening. And of course, me doing that, it kind of made time go much slower and it felt like it wasn't going to grow back. But of course, eventually it did start growing, it started branching. And from that point, I had learned that, yes, it does happen and it is a good way of getting your plant to branch out. So yeah, I learned that. And as a result, I've kind of got, if you see how kind of trunky the stems are, they kind of become woody like this. They start out more green. If you see at the top of this one here, that's typically how they start out. They kind of start out green and soft. And then through the pruning process, eventually you get these woody, thick stems, and the more you prune, the thicker they get. And this plant can actually get quite big into a sort of mini tree. So that's what I'm aiming for with this plant, but I'm just kind of taking my time with it. And yeah, it is quite interesting how the stems kind of become woody eventually. You can kind of see it happening. You get woody patches to start with, and then yeah, they start to turn into this kind of trunk-like appearance. And yeah, so how do I feel about this plant after having it for this many years? It's definitely a good plant for beginners, proved by the fact that I knew nothing when I first got this plant, and I still managed to muddle through somehow, and it's still here today. And honestly, as long as you don't overwater this plant, I'd say it's probably one of the easiest plants out there. But also this plant is quite special for me personally because, as I say, even though it was just one of those cheap novelty supermarket plants, it was kind of one of my oldest plants that got me into this hobby. And a lot of the house plants that I bought back in the day when I didn't know what I was doing are no longer with us. Some of them are, and if you'd like me to talk more about some of my oldest plants, I can. But yeah, this one has made it through, and it kind of reminds me of the beginning of things. And as I say, there were quite a lot of succulents that didn't make it through. So yeah, I think this plant is quite special to me. And my future hopes for this plant is that it will continue growing, and when I become a grandma, I will have one of those plants that are decades old that I can, I don't know, pass on to someone who wants it. I don't have children of my own, but maybe I can try and get my nieces or nephews into plants by then and leave it to them. I don't know. But yeah, it would be really cool to be a grandma with one of those really mature, huge plants. So I'd also be really interested to know if you've had this plant. Maybe you just bought it, or maybe you've had it for a while. Maybe you've had it even longer than me and it's years down the line for you. I'd love to know your experience. Do let me know in the comments. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, maybe give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button as well. It always helps out. And until next time, guys, thanks so much for watching. Make sure you look after your plants and look after yourself.